I've been giving food to the same Bigfoot since 1986. And what he finally showed me about why his family is afraid of humans is something I will never forget. Some people might think I'm crazy for telling this story, but after keeping it secret for almost 40 years, I think it's time everyone knows what really happened. My name is Thomas McKenna. I'm 66 years old, and I used to be a forest ranger at the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington State. This is my story, and I need to tell it exactly how it happened because what I learned changes everything we thought we knew about these creatures. The fall of 1986 painted the forests of the Pacific Northwest in shades of orange and red. I was 28 years old back then, a brand new forest ranger, fresh out of school and excited to start my first real job. I grew up in Portland, spending my summers camping with my dad in the mountains. I loved nature so much that it became my job. The cool October air smelled like pine trees and old leaves as I walked through the thick woods that special day. It was supposed to be just another normal day at work, checking trail signs, writing down what animals I saw, the usual stuff. My boss, an older man named Bill Henderson, had warned me about how lonely the job could be. "Out here, you're on your own most of the time," Bill had said, holding his coffee cup at the ranger station. "The radio only works in some places. If you see something strange, write it down, but don't go looking for trouble. These woods have been here longer than any of us, and they have their secrets." I nodded, thinking Bill was just trying to scare me. After all, what could possibly happen? I was trained for emergencies, knew how to deal with wild animals, and had studied every rule in the Ranger Handbook. I was ready for bears, mountain lions, even lost hikers. What I wasn't ready for was what happened on October 15, 1986. It was late afternoon, around 4:30 in the evening, and the sun was already starting to go down behind the tall trees. I was checking out an old hunting cabin about 6 miles from the main trail. The family who owned the cabin said someone had torn apart their storage shed and scattered their food everywhere. As I got closer to the clearing where the cabin sat, I noticed right away that something was wrong. The damage wasn't what bears usually do. I'd seen lots of bear damage during my training. This was different. The shed's door hadn't just been scratched open. It had been ripped off with incredible strength. Big, deep marks in the soft dirt around the building caught my attention. I got down on my knees to look at them more closely, pulling out my measuring tape and camera. The footprints were huge, at least 17 inches long and 7 inches wide. They looked kind of like human footprints with 5 clear toes, but they were way too big to be human. How deep they were told me that whatever made them was very heavy, probably between 600 and 800 pounds. My heart started beating fast. In all my training, in all the nature books I had studied, nothing matched what I was seeing. Bears leave claw marks. These footprints didn't show any claws, just big, flat marks that looked like giant human feet. I spent the next hour writing down everything I saw, taking pictures from different angles, making plaster copies of the best footprints, measuring how far apart the steps were, an amazing 6 feet between steps, and drawing pictures of the scene in my notebook. The smart part of my brain was collecting information, but another part, a scared part, was telling me to leave. The forest had become strangely quiet. No birds singing, no small animals moving in the bushes, just a creepy silence that seemed to come from everywhere. I had read about this before, how animals go quiet when a big predator is nearby. My hand moved without thinking to the bear spray on my belt. That's when I heard it. A sound like nothing I'd ever heard before. A low, deep noise that seemed to shake the trees themselves. Not quite a growl, not quite a howl, but something in between. It came from somewhere deeper in the forest, maybe 100 yards away. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Every part of me wanted to run, but my training took over. I slowly backed toward my truck, parked on the dirt road about 50 yards from the cabin. My eyes looked at the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. My camera hung around my neck, my notebook held tight in one hand, the other hand near my bear spray. Then I saw it. Between 2 huge cedar trees, partly hidden by shadows and bushes, stood a figure. At first, my brain tried to tell me it was a person in a dark coat, maybe another hiker. But as my eyes got used to the light and the figure moved a little, I knew that wasn't right. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark brown hair. It had wide shoulders that would make a football player look small. And it was watching me. I froze. Every wildlife safety rule I'd ever learned suddenly seemed useless. This wasn't in any handbook. This wasn't supposed to exist. The creature, and my mind finally accepted that's what it was, didn't move in a scary way. It simply stood there, partly hidden, watching. I could see a face, though not clearly in the shadows. Dark eyes that reflected a bit of light, and a ridge on top of its head, like what I'd seen in pictures of gorillas, but bigger. Time seemed to stop. I couldn't say if we stood there staring at each other for 30 seconds or 3 minutes. My brain told me to raise my camera to take a picture of this impossible moment. But my hands wouldn't move. They stayed frozen, one holding my notebook, the other still near my bear spray. The creature made another sound, softer this time, almost curious. Then, with a movement so fast and smooth it seemed impossible for something so big, it turned and disappeared into the forest. I heard heavy footsteps and breaking branches getting quieter as whatever I'd seen moved away. I don't remember getting into my truck. The next thing I clearly remembered was sitting behind the steering wheel, my hand shaking so badly I could barely put the key in. I drove back to the ranger station in a daze, my mind racing with what I'd seen. When I got to the station just after sunset, Bill was still there finishing some paperwork. The older ranger looked at my pale face and immediately poured me a cup of coffee. "You look like you've seen a ghost, kid," Bill said, sitting down across from me. "What happened out there?" I opened my mouth to speak, then closed it again. How could I explain what I'd seen? Bill would think I was crazy or worse, that I couldn't handle being alone on the job. I'd be moved to a different job, maybe even fired. All my dreams of being a forest ranger would disappear because I'd seen something that wasn't supposed to exist. "I just had a scary moment with what might have been a bear," I finally said. The lie felt wrong in my mouth. Got spooked. "I'm fine now." Bill looked at me for a long moment, his gray eyes sharp. "The cabin damage, you write it down?" "Yeah," I said, glad to change the subject. I pulled out my camera and notebook, took photos and measurements, made some copies of footprints. They're weird. Might be a big bear, but the footprints don't match any bear tracks I've seen before. Bill looked through the notebook, his face showing nothing. He looked at the measurements, the drawings, the detailed notes I had made. When he got to the description of the footprints, 17 inches long, shaped like human feet, no claw marks, he became very still. "These measurements correct?" Bill asked quietly. "Yes, sir. I checked them 3 times. Bill closed the notebook and handed it back to me. "Write your report. Document everything you saw." "But Thomas," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "out here in these woods, sometimes we see things that don't fit with what we learned in school. Best thing to do is write it down professionally and keep an open mind." There was something in Bill's voice that made me look up quickly. The older ranger's face showed nothing, but his eyes held something else. Maybe he understood. Maybe he'd seen it too. "Have you ever?" I started to ask, then stopped myself. Bill stood up, stretching his back. "I've been a ranger in these woods for 32 years, kid. I've seen a lot of things. Some of them went into official reports. Some of them didn't." He paused at the door. "Get some rest. And Thomas, if you ever see something unusual again, you can talk to me. Off the record." After Bill left, I sat alone in the station, staring at my notebook. The official report I'd have to write wouldn't mention what I'd really seen. It would be about property damage and unusual tracks, possibly from a large bear. But in my personal journal, locked in my desk drawer, I wrote down every detail of what happened while it was still fresh in my mind. I described how big the creature was, how it moved, the way it had watched me with what seemed like intelligence rather than just animal curiosity. I drew pictures of what I'd seen, trying to capture the shape of its face, how wide its shoulders were, the way it had moved through the forest so gracefully despite its size. That night, lying in my small cabin near the ranger station, I couldn't sleep. Every sound from the forest seemed louder. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves. But it wasn't just fear that kept me awake. It was something else. Wonder. Whatever I'd seen out there was real. It existed in these forests, living its life in the shadows, staying away from humans. And somehow, for just a few minutes, I had been allowed to see it. I didn't know it then, but that October evening would change my entire life. The creature I'd seen, the one that wasn't supposed to exist, the one that lived only in legends and campfire stories, would become the focus of the next 38 years of my life. And in that time, I would learn its secrets. I would discover why it hid from humans so carefully, and that knowledge would break my heart. For 3 weeks after that first time I saw it, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Every free moment, I found myself pulling out my notebook, looking at the drawings I'd made, checking the measurements of those impossible footprints. The plaster copies sat on my desk like proof of something my brain still wanted to say didn't exist. I started doing lots of research. On my days off, I drove to the University of Washington Library in Seattle, spending hours reading books about animals and Native American stories. I read every book I could find about Pacific Northwest wildlife, native stories, and yes, even the weird books about Bigfoot sightings. What I found was a mix of obvious fakes, real mysteries, and Native American traditions that talked about Sasquatch or other wild men of the woods who stayed away from humans. In their stories, these creatures weren't monsters. They were beings to be respected, avoided, left alone. They keep to themselves, one story I read said. They don't want our world, and we shouldn't want theirs. But I did want to know more. Not to capture it or prove it existed. Something deeper than that. I wanted to understand. What was it doing in those woods? Was it alone? How had it stayed hidden for so long? And most importantly, would I ever see it again? The answer came on November 7th, 1986. I had started changing my patrol routes to take me past that hunting cabin more often. Not every day, I didn't want people to ask questions, but 2 or 3 times a week. I'd find a good reason to be in that area, like checking on winter preparations or looking for hunters who shouldn't be there. It was a gray Friday afternoon, the kind of day where the clouds hung so low they seemed to get stuck in the treetops. Light rain had been falling since morning, making the forest floor quiet and wet. I was about half a mile from the cabin, writing notes about some elk tracks, when I heard the sound again. That same low, deep sound that had frozen my blood 3 weeks earlier. But this time, I didn't run. My heart pounded fast. My body filled with nervous energy, but I stayed where I was. Slowly, carefully, I stood up from where I'd been kneeling. My hand went to the bear spray on my belt, but I didn't take it out. Instead, I just stood there, waiting. The sound came again, closer this time, maybe 50 yards away from a thick group of young trees and bushes. I could hear something big moving through the plants, breaking branches, making the wet leaves rustle. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said out loud, my voice sounding strange in the quiet forest. I felt silly talking to what might be the wind or a bear, but something in my gut told me to try. "I'm just here doing my job. I'm not a threat." The movement stopped. The forest went silent except for the soft sound of rain on leaves. Then slowly, the branches moved apart and there it was again. In the gray daylight, even with rain and mist, I could see it much more clearly than during that first evening. The creature stood at the edge of the bushes about 40 yards away, partly hidden but clearly visible. It was every bit as huge as I remembered, probably 8.5 feet tall, with shoulders that must have been 4 feet across. Its body was covered in dark brown hair, longer around the shoulders and head, shorter on the arms and chest. The face was both human-like and not human-like. A wide flat nose, heavy eyebrow ridge, lips that were fuller than a gorilla's but thinner than a human's. And the eyes, dark, smart eyes that watched me with careful curiosity. We stood there in the rain, looking at each other. I noticed details I'd missed in the panic of the first time I saw it. The creature's hands were huge with thick fingers and what looked like fingernails rather than claws. Its feet, partly visible in the bushes, matched the footprints I'd made copies of, wide, flat, surprisingly like human feet. It was breathing heavily, its huge chest moving up and down. I could see the rain hitting its hair, running off in streams. It seemed to be thinking about me, trying to decide something. Very slowly, trying not to make sudden movements, I sat down on a fallen log. I wanted to show I wasn't threatening, to show I wasn't going to chase or attack. I kept my hands where it could see them, away from the bear's spray. "I saw you before," I said quietly, not sure if talking was helping or hurting. "At the cabin. I've been hoping I'd see you again." The creature's head tilted a little, reminding me of a dog trying to understand human words. Could it understand what I was saying, or was it just listening to how I sounded? I slowly reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out an apple, part of my lunch that I hadn't eaten. Without standing up, without making any scary movements, I gently tossed it onto the ground about halfway between us. "I don't know if you eat these," I said, "but if you do, you can have it." For a long moment, nothing happened. The creature stared at the apple, then at me, then back at the apple. I could almost see it thinking, was this a trick? A trap? What did this strange human want? Then, with movements that were surprisingly graceful for something so big, it moved forward. Not all the way to the apple. It stopped about 10 feet from it. Then it did something I never expected. It made sounds again, but differently this time. Not the low, deep sound from before, but shorter sounds, almost like clicks or soft grunts. It was trying to communicate something, though I had no idea what. "I don't understand," I admitted. "But I'm listening." The creature reached down, and I noticed for the first time that it had been carrying something. From the bushes where it had come from, it picked up what looked like a branch with several bunches of berries still on it. With a movement that was clearly on purpose, it placed the branch on the ground, then stepped back. My breath caught. It was giving something back. I had offered food, and it was offering food in return. "Thank you," I said, my voice cracking. Thank you." We stayed like that for what must have been 10 minutes, though it felt both longer and shorter. The creature eventually reached forward, quickly grabbed the apple, and moved back toward the bushes. It didn't eat the apple right away. Instead, it held it, looking at it, smelling it. Then, with one last long look at me, it turned and disappeared into the forest. I heard it moving away, the sound getting quieter until there was nothing but rain and wind. I sat there on that log for another 20 minutes, trying to understand what had just happened. When I finally stood up, my legs were shaky. I walked to where the creature had left the berry branch and carefully picked it up. The berries were fresh, perfectly ripe. I ate one. It was sweet and delicious. That night, I added another entry to my private journal, writing down every detail of what happened. But I also started a new section, a log of meetings, because I knew somehow that this wouldn't be the last time. I was right. Over the next 3 months, I saw the creature 6 more times. Never at the same place, never at the same time of day, but always in roughly the same area of the forest, a territory of maybe 4 or 5 square miles around that hunting cabin. The pattern was interesting. The creature seemed to be watching my movements, keeping track of when and where I went. Sometimes I'd hear it before I'd see it, that special sound I was beginning to recognize. Other times, I'd simply feel watched and would catch a glimpse of it observing from far away. I started bringing gifts every time I went to that area. Apples, granola bars, sometimes leftover parts of my lunch. I'd leave them on tree stumps or rocks in places where I'd seen signs the creature had been. They were always gone by my next visit, and the creature left things in return. Not every time, but often enough that I knew it was on purpose. Interesting stones, pine cones arranged in small piles, once a perfect bird's nest that had fallen from a tree. It was trying to communicate, to build some kind of friendship. By late January 1987, something amazing happened. I was on patrol and had just left one of my usual gifts, a couple of protein bars and an orange, when I heard movement behind me. I turned slowly, and there it was, less than 20 feet away. But this time, it didn't keep far away. It moved closer, stopping about 10 feet from me. Close enough that I could see the texture of its hair, the way its chest moved with each breath, the incredible detail of its face. We looked at each other, and I saw something in its eyes that changed everything. Not just intelligence, I'd already seen that, but something deeper, sadness, maybe tiredness from experience. This wasn't just an animal trying to figure out if I was dangerous. This was a thinking being, one that had learned to fear humans, trying to decide if I was different. "I won't hurt you," I said softly. "And I won't tell anyone about you. You have my word." I don't know if it understood my words, but it seemed to understand what I meant. It reached down, picked up the protein bars carefully, almost gently, despite its huge hands, and made a sound. Not the warning sound, not the curious clicks. Something else, something that sounded almost like thankfulness. Then it did something that brought tears to my eyes. It reached out one huge hand and gently touched a nearby tree trunk, then looked at me and touched its own chest. It was showing me something. The forest was its home. Its chest meant itself. It was telling me who it was in this place. I copied the gesture, touching the tree, then my own chest. "This is your home," I said. "I understand. I'll respect that." The creature watched me for a moment longer, then turned and walked away. But before it disappeared into the trees, it looked back once. And I could have sworn, I know this sounds impossible, but I could have sworn it was making sure I was still there, still watching. That was the moment everything changed. That was when a simple forest ranger's curiosity became something more, a commitment, a promise, a friendship, if such a thing could exist between creatures so different yet somehow not different at all. I had no idea then that this relationship would last for decades. I had no idea that I would eventually learn this creature's story, understand its fears, discover the dark truth about what humans had done to force its kind into hiding. All I knew in that moment was that I had been trusted with something precious, a secret, a connection to something the world thought didn't exist. And I was determined to protect it, no matter what it cost me. The years that followed taught me patience I never knew I had. Building trust with a creature that had every reason to fear humans wasn't a matter of weeks or months. It took years of steady, careful meetings. By the spring of 1987, I had set up a routine. 3 times a week, I'd go to what I'd started thinking of as our territory, that 5-square-mile area of forest where the creature seemed to live. I'd bring food, always different. Fresh fruits, vegetables, nuts, sometimes dried meats or fish. I learned through trying what it liked. Apples were always popular, berries of any kind. It seemed to especially enjoy salmon, not surprising since we were in the Pacific Northwest. I'd leave the gifts in specific places, and over time, the creature began meeting me at these spots. Not every time, but more and more often. Sometimes it would watch from far away. Other times, it would come close, take the food, and leave something in return. Always these small gifts, interesting rocks, shells from the river, once a perfect set of deer antlers it must have found. But the real big change came in June of that year. I had arrived at one of our usual meeting spots, a small clearing near a creek that ran through the forest. I brought a bag full of apples, some carrots, and a large salmon I'd caught that morning. I was arranging the food on a flat rock when I heard the now familiar sound of heavy footsteps coming closer. The creature came out from the trees, but this time it wasn't alone. My heart almost stopped. Behind the large male I'd been meeting with, I'd figured out it was male based on its size, was a smaller figure. Still big by human standards, maybe 7 feet tall, with slightly reddish-brown fur instead of dark brown. It stayed back, partly hidden behind the larger creature, watching me nervously. "You brought someone," I said softly, keeping my voice calm despite my racing heart. "That's okay. There's plenty of food." The larger creature, I'd started thinking of him as Old Jack, though I never said the name out loud, made quiet sounds toward the smaller one. It sounded almost like encouragement or comfort. The way they communicated was clear, even if I couldn't understand the details. Slowly, Old Jack walked up to the rock where I'd put the food. He picked up the salmon, his favorite, but instead of eating it or taking it away, he turned and offered it to the smaller creature. A female, I realized, watching them interact. Maybe his mate, or a sister. She came closer carefully, eyes never leaving me. When she was about 15 feet away, Old Jack made another soft sound, and she quickly took the salmon from his hands and went back toward the trees. But she didn't leave completely. She stayed at the edge of the clearing, watching as Old Jack gathered up some of the apples and carrots. Before he left, Old Jack did something he'd never done before. He sat down right there in the clearing about 20 feet from where I stood. He began eating one of the apples, watching me as he did. I understood what he was doing. He was showing the female that I was safe, that this human could be trusted. It was the biggest gesture of trust he'd shown me yet. I sat down too, on a log on my side of the clearing, and we ate together in friendly silence. I ate an energy bar from my pack while he ate 3 apples. The female eventually came close enough to grab a few carrots before going back again. That day was a turning point. Over the following months, I met the female several more times. She was more nervous than old Jack, always keeping her distance. But she was getting used to me, and I began to understand something important. These creatures had a social structure, relationships, possibly even families. As 1987 turned into 1988, and then 1989, my relationship with old Jack grew deeper in ways I never could have expected. He began showing me things, not just accepting food, but actually trying to share more complicated ideas. One day in the fall of 1989, he led me deeper into the forest than I'd ever gone in that area. I followed at a respectful distance, curious but careful. We walked for maybe 20 minutes before we came to a small cave, barely visible behind hanging moss and ferns. Old Jack stopped at the entrance and pointed toward it, a clear, "Look at this," motion. I came closer slowly and looked inside. The cave was small, maybe 10 feet deep, but dry and sheltered. And inside were things that made me gasp. Carefully arranged piles of food, nuts, dried berries, roots, a bed of soft ferns and moss. And most surprising of all, tools, crude but clear. Rocks that had been shaped for specific jobs. Sticks worn smooth from use. "This is your home," I said, looking back at old Jack. "You're showing me where you live." He made a soft sound, one I'd come to recognize as yes. But there was something else in his eyes, something that looked almost like he was being vulnerable. He was trusting me with his most important secret, where he was most at risk, where he slept, where he kept his supplies. I backed away from the cave entrance immediately. "Thank you for showing me," I said. "I won't tell anyone, and I'll never come here without you. You have my word." Over the next several years, our bond continued to grow. I learned to understand his different sounds, to know the small differences in tone that meant different things. He learned to recognize the sound of my truck's engine and would often be waiting when I arrived. We developed our own way of communicating. Part sound, part gesture, part just knowing. By 1995, I had been meeting with old Jack for 9 years. In that time, I'd seen the female. I'd started thinking of her as Sarah, though again just in my mind, dozens of times. I'd watched what I believed were them showing affection. I'd seen old Jack bring her gifts of food, seen them sit together at the edge of clearings while I left food. And then in the spring of 1995, something incredible happened. I arrived at one of our meeting spots to find old Jack waiting. But he was upset. He was pacing back and forth, making sounds I'd never heard before. Urgent, almost worried. My first thought was that he was hurt or that Sarah was hurt. "What's wrong?" I asked right away, concerned. "Are you okay? Is Sarah okay?" He moved toward me, then away, then back again. He was trying to get me to follow him. Without thinking twice, I did. He led me on a path through the forest, moving faster than usual, but checking back often to make sure I was keeping up. We walked for maybe 15 minutes before he brought me to a small grove of cedar trees. And there, hidden in a nest of ferns and moss, was Sarah. And in her arms, barely visible against her reddish fur, was the tiniest Bigfoot I'd ever seen. A baby. I stopped completely, feeling overwhelmed. Sarah looked at me with eyes that held both protectiveness and something else. Maybe hope that I would react the right way to this moment. "Oh my God," I whispered. "You have a baby." The baby couldn't have been more than a few days old. Its eyes were barely open, and it held onto Sarah with tiny hands that were perfect small versions of its parents. Its fur was lighter than both parents, almost golden brown. Old Jack moved to stand between me and his family. Not in a scary way, but protectively. He made a soft sound, and I understood what he was saying. "Look, but don't come closer." "I understand," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Congratulations to both of you. This is wonderful." I stood there for maybe 10 minutes just watching from a respectful distance as Sarah held her baby, as old Jack stood guard. Then, understanding that I'd been shown something sacred, something private, I slowly backed away. Before I left, old Jack followed me a short distance. When we were away from Sarah and the baby, he did something amazing. He placed one of his huge hands on a tree trunk, then on his chest, the gesture we'd created years ago for home or self. Then he pointed back toward where his family was and made the softest, most gentle sound I'd ever heard from him. He was telling me about his family, about what they meant to him, about love in a language that went beyond species. "I'll protect them," I promised him. "I'll protect all of you. Always." And I meant it with every part of me. Over the next months and years, I watched that baby grow. I saw it take its first shaky steps, watched it learn to look for food, saw old Jack teach it which plants were safe to eat, how to catch fish from the streams. It was like being given a window into a world that shouldn't exist, a secret that the forest had kept for thousands of years. The young one, I thought of it as little Jack, though I later learned it was actually female, was curious about me in a way her parents never quite were. By the time she was 2 years old, she would come much closer than Sarah ever had, though always under her parents' watchful eyes. But as the years passed, I began to notice something troubling. Old Jack was showing signs of past hurt I hadn't recognized before. Sometimes when I'd arrive for our meetings, I'd find him upset, pacing, making worried sounds. He'd lead me to areas of the forest where there were signs of human activity. Old campsites, trash that had been left behind, once even a hunting platform that had been built in a tree. He was showing me people coming into his territory. And more than that, he seemed to be trying to tell me something about humans, about why he and his kind stayed hidden, about what had made them so scared. It would take many more years before I understood the full truth. Before old Jack finally showed me the dark reason why Bigfoot avoids humans so carefully. But by the late 1990s, I knew I was close to discovering something deep and heartbreaking. Something that would change everything I thought I knew about the relationship between humans and these wonderful creatures. The year 2000 brought changes to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. More hikers, more tourists, more people wanting to escape into the wilderness that had once been pretty isolated. For me, now in my early 40s and a senior ranger, it meant more patrols, more rules to enforce, and more chances for human Bigfoot meetings that could go terribly wrong. I became super careful about old Jack's territory, always finding reasons to patrol that area more often. If I saw signs of illegal camping or hunting near where I knew he and his family spent time, I'd shut it down right away. Sometimes I'd make up violations to move people along. My co-workers probably thought I was too strict. But I didn't care. I had a secret to protect. By 2003, little Jack, who I'd learned was actually female when she got older, was 8 years old and almost as tall as Sarah. She'd become comfortable enough with me that she'd sometimes come within arm's reach, though I never tried to touch her. That line felt sacred, something that shouldn't be crossed, even after 17 years of building trust. It was during that summer that everything changed, that I finally learned the truth I'd been sensing but couldn't quite understand. I arrived at our usual meeting spot on a warm July afternoon carrying a cooler full of fresh salmon and berries. Old Jack was there, but something was wrong. He was sitting on the ground, hunched over, making low-pained sounds I'd never heard before. "Jack!" I called out, dropping the cooler and moving toward him without thinking. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" He looked up at me, and what I saw in his eyes stopped me cold. Not physical pain, something deeper. Emotional pain. Memories coming up that he'd kept buried. He stood slowly, and for the first time in all our years together, he came right up to me. He came within 5 feet, closer than he'd ever been, and then did something that made me catch my breath. He turned his back to me and lifted his left arm. His fur, which usually lay smooth and thick, was messed up along his left side. And underneath, visible through the thinner hair, were scars, deep, old scars that ran in lines across his ribs and down his back. They were partly hidden by fur that had grown back over them. But once I knew to look, they were clear. "Oh my God!" I whispered. "Jack, what happened to you?" He turned back to face me and began to communicate in a way he never had before. Using hand movements, sounds, and acting things out, he started to tell me his story. He pointed to himself, then held his hand low to the ground, showing he'd been young. Then he held up both hands with fingers spread, meaning many, a group, a family. My heart began to sink as I understood. He'd had a family before Sarah, before I met him. He made walking motions with his fingers, showing movement through the forest. Then he stopped and crouched low, making himself small, hiding. He pointed to his eyes, then forward, watching. Then he formed his hands into the shape of a gun. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "Hunters," I said. "Hunters found your family." He made a sound of agreement, but there was so much pain in it that tears came to my eyes. He continued his story, showing me through gestures what words couldn't say. His family had been attacked. He'd been young, maybe like a teenager. He'd watched from hiding as hunters. He showed me multiple figures, maybe 4 or 5, had trapped his family. He showed me running, showed me the sound of gunfire by clapping his hands sharply, showed me falling, being hurt. His hand traced along those scars on his side. "You were shot," I said, my voice breaking. "They shot you." He nodded, a gesture he'd learned from watching me over the years. Then he showed me playing dead, lying still while the hunters came closer. He made gestures of the hunters looking at something, talking, maybe arguing, then leaving. He'd survived by pretending to be dead. But his family. Old Jack's huge shoulders shook. He made a sound of such deep grief that I couldn't help myself. I took a step closer and placed my hand on a nearby tree, the gesture we used for, "I'm here. I understand." He looked at me with eyes full of ancient pain and continued. He showed me staying hidden, watching from the shadows as more humans came. Different ones this time. He gestured at clothing that looked official, maybe uniforms. They'd taken the bodies away, covered everything up, made it disappear. "That's why you hide," I said, understanding finally washing over me. "That's why all of you hide. Because we hunt you. Because we've always hunted you." He made another sound of agreement. But then he did something else. He formed his hands into shapes I'd seen before. Small shapes, medium shapes, large shapes. He was showing me different groups, different families. Then he showed them disappearing one by one, getting smaller and fewer. "There aren't many of you left, are there?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He held up both hands with fingers spread, then closed them into fists. Opened them again, showing fewer fingers, then fewer. Over and over, showing me numbers going down. His kind was disappearing, being hunted, being forced from their homes as humans moved into every corner of the wilderness. "How long ago?" I asked. "How long ago did you lose your family?" He showed me seasons passing, the gesture he used for years. Once, twice, 3 times. He kept going. 7 times, 8, 9 times. He showed me the cycle of seasons 9 years before I met him. He'd been living alone, hurt and hiding, for almost 10 years before that day in 1986 when he'd watched me check out the hunting cabin. He'd been watching humans, trying to understand if any of us could be trusted, if any of us were different from the ones who killed his family. And somehow he'd decided to take a chance on me. "I'm so sorry," I said, tears running down my face now. "I'm so sorry for what they did to you, for what my kind has done to yours." Old Jack made a soft sound and did something he'd never done before. He reached out one huge hand and gently touched my shoulder, just for a moment, then pulled back. But in that gesture was forgiveness, understanding, recognition that I was different, that not all humans were the same. He pointed to himself, then to Sarah, and showed me little Jack's eyes when she was born. He'd found Sarah years after the attack, both of them alone, both survivors. They'd made a new family, found a way to keep living despite the hurt and fear. But the scars remained. The memories remained. The terror that drove them deeper into the shrinking wilderness remained. Over the next several visits, old Jack showed me more. He showed me other signs he'd found in the forest over the years, spent bullet shells, broken equipment, places where others of his kind had been hunted. He led me to a hidden valley deeper in the mountains where he said others sometimes gathered, a safe place of sorts, though he showed me it was getting harder to reach as roads and development came closer. He showed me photographs. Yes, photographs. Hidden away in a waterproof container in his cave were old newspaper clippings and photos that he'd collected over the years, evidence of his kind being hunted, being shown off as prizes, being treated as monsters instead of the smart, peaceful beings they were. The clippings were from the 1960s and 70s, yellow with age. Headlines about Bigfoot hunting trips and Sasquatch rewards. Photos of men with guns smiling as they posed in the forest. Some of the articles described creatures that had been killed, though the bodies were always mysteriously lost or taken by authorities. "They've been hunting you for sport," I said, looking at the evidence he'd carefully kept. "For trophies, for proof, for money." He nodded, then showed me something else. Gestures showing capture, cages, laboratories. Some of his kind hadn't just been hunted and killed, they'd been captured, taken alive. He didn't know where or by whom, but he knew it had happened. The fear of it was passed down through the remaining families, a terror that kept them awake at night, kept them silent, kept them hidden. I understood then why Bill Henderson had reacted the way he did all those years ago when he'd seen my first report. Why he'd told me some things didn't go into official records. He'd known. Maybe he'd even seen proof himself. The government, or parts of it, knew these creatures existed. And for reasons I could only guess at, to prevent panic, to protect business interests, to keep control, they kept it secret. And in that secrecy, Bigfoot had no protection, no rights, no recognition of their existence that might make killing them murder instead of just an unusual form of hunting. "I'll protect you," I promised old Jack again, but this time with full understanding of what I was protecting them from. "I'll keep your secret. I'll watch over your territory, and I'll teach little Jack to be careful, to stay hidden, to survive." He touched my shoulder again, that same gentle gesture. Then he gathered up the newspaper clippings and photos, carefully placing them back in their waterproof container. Evidence of a genocide that no one talked about. Proof of a species being killed off while the world pretended they didn't exist. As I left the forest that day, I felt the weight of what I'd learned crushing down on me. For 17 years, I'd been feeding a friend, building a relationship I valued. But I'd been naive about what that friendship meant in the bigger picture. Old Jack hadn't just been accepting my food and company. He'd been teaching me, preparing me to understand, making sure that at least one human knew the truth, so that maybe, somehow, that truth wouldn't die with him and his kind. I drove home in silence, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. How many were left? How long before they were gone completely? What could one forest ranger possibly do against the forces that had been hunting them for generations? But I knew one thing for certain. I would do whatever I could for old Jack, for Sarah, for little Jack, and for whatever others remained hidden in the deep forests. They deserved to exist. They deserved to be left in peace. And I would spend the rest of my career making sure that in at least this one corner of the wilderness, they would be safe. The years moved on, quiet but heavy. I never spoke of old Jack's story. Not to my wife, not to my closest co-workers, not even to Bill in his final years on the job. It wasn't just keeping secrets for the sake of keeping secrets. I understood now that speaking their truth carelessly could mean they'd disappear completely. One wrong word, and someone with the wrong reasons could trace my patrol records, investigate the area, and destroy everything they had left. By the time 2010 arrived, I had spent 24 years protecting that family. 24 years of meeting the same towering figure beneath the cedars, of exchanging gifts, of watching little Jack grow from a curious child into a confident young adult. Her fur darkened to a deep reddish color, and she moved with confidence that could only come from parents who taught her every hidden trail, every freshwater pool, every scent carried by the wind. I watched her learn to fish in the Lewis River, just as I'd seen children learn to ride bikes. She moved silently between mossy rocks, catching salmon with movements so smooth they looked practiced, like art passed down through generations. Old Jack watched from the riverbank, chest forward, proud. Sometimes he'd glance toward me as if making sure I was seeing what he saw, proof that his family line continued despite everything that had tried to erase them. By then I wasn't just feeding a creature. I was witnessing a legacy. As the world around us changed, new highways, cameras in every hand, more people flooding the wilderness looking for experiences, I began to fear that time was running out. More than once, I convinced hikers to try a different trail, making up closures or safety problems to keep them away. A few times, I stopped hunters setting up platforms too close to Old Jack's territory. I took their equipment, wrote tickets, even threatened to report them for poaching when no laws technically covered what they were doing. But every year, I saw more evidence of people coming in. And every year, Old Jack grew more tense. Sometimes he'd bring me branches broken cleanly in half, his signal that strangers had been near. Other times he would show me marks in the mud, boot prints, and look at me with that same haunted fear that first showed up when he revealed his scars. One late autumn night, I heard him before I saw him. I'd been hiking in thick fog, headlights from my truck cutting into the quiet. His call came from somewhere beyond the creek, low and shaking. I had never heard him sound afraid for himself, only for others. I hurried toward the sound. The forest was unusually silent. No owls, no insects, just mist and the quiet sound of distant river water. Old Jack came out from behind a group of Douglas firs, shoulders tense, body ready. He motioned for me to follow, urgently. I'd seen this once before, the day he showed me little Jack for the first time. My chest tightened. Something was wrong. We hiked for nearly 20 minutes, deeper than I'd ever gone without his help. Even in the fog, he moved confidently, checking behind him often to make sure I kept up. Finally, we reached a clearing I didn't recognize. There, sitting on the ground, was Sarah. Her usually bright eyes looked dull, unfocused. She leaned against a fallen log, breathing shallowly, for sticking to her side where blood, dark and already drying, had soaked through. My stomach dropped. She had been shot. Old Jack lowered himself beside her, making soft, rhythmic sounds. Comfort, reassurance. Little Jack knelt on the other side, her huge hands shaking as she tried to clean the wound with wet moss. I took careful steps forward. "I'm here. I'm here," I whispered, though I knew my words meant little. Still, Old Jack looked at me with something desperate in his eyes, pleading. He trusted me. I knelt, looking at the wound without touching. The bullet had cut through muscle, high enough to miss organs, low enough to slow her to a crawl. A hunting round, still inside. Sarah let out a soft noise that sounded almost like an apology. Little Jack's hand brushed her cheek, and in the dim fog-filtered moonlight, I understood I wasn't just seeing an injury. I was seeing fear. Fear based on history. Fear of a cycle repeating. Whoever had done this was close. And they would return. I didn't have medical tools. Not out here. And even if I had, I'd never done more than help veterinarians in the park with sleeping bears and elk. But I knew about infection. I knew about wounds. I knew painfully that normal help was not an option. "I need to clean it," I said quietly. Old Jack lowered his head in understanding. I got my water bottle, soaked a cloth, and began carefully cleaning the matted fur just to see how bad the bleeding was. Sarah trembled with each touch. I spoke softly, keeping my voice steady. Little Jack watched every movement, learning. The bullet was still deep inside. I didn't dare try to take it out. Not with my hands. Not here. Removing it could kill her faster. "We have to keep it clean," I said, unsure whether I was reassuring them or myself. "I'll bring supplies, medicine, antiseptic." Old Jack made a low, steady sound. Agreement. When I finished, Sarah let out a faint breath, relief or exhaustion. Little Jack helped adjust a bed of thick ferns beneath her. I placed my hand on the trunk of the cedar beside them, our gesture of promise. "I'll be back before sunrise." I hesitated only one moment before running through the fog, branches slapping against my arms, lungs burning. I reached my truck, drove fast back to my cabin. If anyone saw me, I had practiced explanations, routine medical emergency, wildlife rescue, anything. But the roads were empty. Inside my cabin, I grabbed everything I had, medical bandages, antibiotic cream, iodine, pain relievers I ground into powder, a hunting knife, a clean blanket. I turned to leave and froze. My cabin window facing the trees was open. I never left it open. A sheet of notebook paper lay on the counter. At first, I thought it was something I'd left out, maybe a note to myself. But the handwriting wasn't mine. It was bold, heavy strokes like someone not used to writing. "Don't go back there." My blood ran cold. I checked the locks. All fine. Nothing stolen. No vehicles outside. But someone had been here, someone who knew. I grabbed my supplies anyway and returned to the forest. The fog was still thick when I returned, though the eastern sky had begun to show the first silver hints of dawn. I made my way back to the grove as quietly as I could, praying no one had followed. Old Jack met me halfway, towering and restless, every muscle tight. He brought me quickly to Sarah. She didn't look good, breathing shallow, eyes barely open. Little Jack held her mother's hand, rocking slightly, a movement I'd seen human children make when frightened. I started working right away. Clean water, iodine, bandages. The wound responded, bleeding slowed, breathing steadied. Not healed, not safe, but stable. All the while, old Jack watched the tree line. Not me, not Sarah, the forest. He knew danger better than anyone. When I finished, he let out a sound, soft, grateful. Little Jack pressed her forehead gently to Sarah's. The family huddled close, breathing as one. I was about to leave them to rest when a new sound broke the quiet. A branch crack, sharp and deliberate. 3 shapes came out through the fog. Human. They moved with confidence. They carried rifles. Old Jack rose to his full height, a silent wall between danger and family. My heart slammed against my ribs. The hunters had returned. They came out of the fog like ghosts, 3 men in camouflage, rifles held tight to their chests, boots sinking softly into the moss-covered ground. Their faces were hard, eyes sharp, looking at the grove as though they'd practiced this moment 100 times. The tallest lifted binoculars, and even through the haze, I knew when he saw old Jack. His breath caught. "There," he whispered. Old Jack didn't roar, didn't threaten, didn't move toward them. He simply stood, wide, towering, unmovable, placing his body between the hunters and his family. I raised my hands immediately. "Stop. Don't do this." My voice cracked through the clearing. The men turned their attention to me. Recognition flickered. One of them narrowed his eyes. "McKenna." I froze. They knew my name. "You've been interfering out here for years," another said. "Driving people away, flagging reports. Should have known you were hiding something." "You don't understand," I said, palms out. "They're not dangerous. They just want to be left alone." "They're animals," the leader replied coldly. "You know how much one of these things is worth?" Old Jack made a soft, low sound. Not aggression, a plea. Little Jack crouched behind him, gripping Sarah's hand. "If you shoot him," I said, "you'll prove everything he's ever believed about us." The leader breathed out, steadying his rifle. "We're taking one. Doesn't matter which." I stepped in front of him. "You'll have to shoot me first." For a moment, the forest held its breath. Moss, damp air, distant river. 3 rifles, a family terrified and silent. A line in the dirt. The leader's jaw clenched. He didn't raise his weapon again, but he didn't lower it either. "Do you think you can stop this?" he hissed. "You've spent your whole career babysitting monsters. But you're one man. You retire and all this goes away." I kept my voice quiet, steady. "I've watched them raise their child. I've seen them mourn their dead. They feel the world the same way we do. If you wanted proof they were dangerous, you would have had it the moment you stepped into this clearing." Silence. Their rifles pointed just a little less tightly. Behind me, old Jack made a sound, low, deep. I'd heard it only once before, the day he told me about his scars. He took a single step forward. Not threatening. Standing tall. Claiming his right to exist. The hunters hesitated because for a moment they saw him as I did. Not a monster. Not a myth. A father. A survivor. The leader finally breathed out, eyes shifting from Jack to the wounded Sarah, then to little Jack trembling, trying to be brave. He cursed under his breath. "Forget it," he muttered. They move deeper, we'll never track them. One of the others protested. We can mark the spot. No, the leader cut him off. We go. And just like that, they turned. They disappeared back into the fog. No celebration. No parting threat. Just a reluctant retreat. When the forest swallowed them, the tension broke like a snapped wire. My legs nearly gave out. Old Jack's head bowed, not in fear, but in gratitude. Sarah breathed easier. Little Jack let out a shaking sigh, touching her father's arm the way children do when they don't have words for relief. I knelt, shaking. They'll come back, I whispered. Maybe not today, but someday. You have to go deeper, farther. Old Jack looked toward the mountains, snow-capped shapes beyond the ridge, places where humans rarely go, places even rangers seldom patrol. He understood. He turned to Sarah, then to little Jack. They rose together, leaning into one another, a single shape of family. Before they left, old Jack placed his hand on the cedar trunk, our old gesture, and then on his own chest. Self. Memory. I copied him, tears blurring my vision. Then he stepped forward and just once, rested his huge hand over my heart. A thank you. A goodbye. A passing of responsibility. They disappeared into the mist, three shapes returning to the ancient world that made them. I never saw them again. I retired in 2016. Sometimes when hikers report strange sounds in the distance or footprints too large to belong to any bear, I smile. Because somewhere beyond the places where roads go and maps end, a family still walks beneath the cedars. A living piece of history, quiet, careful, surviving. And though the world never knew their names, I remember them. Old Jack. Sarah. Little Jack. I still leave apples on a stump deep in Gifford Pinchot, where moss grows thick and the trees block out the sky. They're always gone by morning. Maybe it's deer. Maybe it's raccoons. Or maybe it's a promise being kept. Because some secrets aren't meant to be solved, just honored.